Some trails lead you to a destination, others lead you somewhere far darker. Evan loved the solitude of the mountains. Hiking had always been his escape from the noise and pressure of the city. The endless trails winding through towering pines offered a peace he couldn't find anywhere else. He had his favorite route, a challenging but rewarding loop that meandered through dense woods and offered breathtaking views from the summit. One crisp autumn morning, he set out early to enjoy the trail before it got busy. He parked his truck at the base, adjusted his pack, and started up the familiar path. The leaves were turning, painting the forest in hues of gold and crimson. A soft wind rustled the branches, and the distant chirping of birds accompanied his steps. Evan didn't see another soul during the first few miles. The isolation was exactly what he'd hoped for. But as he rounded a bend, he caught sight of a figure ahead. A woman, dressed in a hooded gray jacket, stood motionless on the path. Her back was to him, and she didn't move, even as he approached. "Morning?" Evan called out, his voice breaking the stillness. The woman didn't respond. She remained perfectly still, her hood pulled low. Evan slowed his pace, unsure of what to do. Maybe she hadn't heard him, or maybe she was lost. "Are you okay?" he asked, stepping closer. Finally, she turned. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. There was something off about her gaze. It didn't quite meet his, as though she were looking past him. "Turn back," she said, her voice a raspy whisper. "Don't go up there." Evan blinked, startled. "Excuse me?" The woman's expression didn't change. "They don't like visitors." Before he could ask who they were, she turned and walked into the trees, vanishing between the trunks as if she'd never been there. Evan stood frozen for a moment, her warning echoing in his mind, but he shook it off. He wasn't one to be scared off by strange encounters. People said all sorts of weird things in the wilderness. He adjusted his pack and continued up the trail, though he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping over him. The higher Evan climbed, the quieter the forest became. The usual sounds of nature, chirping birds, rustling leaves, seemed to fade, replaced by an unnatural stillness. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the woman again, but the path behind him was empty. After another mile, he reached a fork in the trail. The left path led to the summit, while the right descended into a narrow ravine. He had always taken the left path, but today, something compelled him to go right. Maybe it was curiosity or the lingering unease from his earlier encounter. The ravine was darker, the trees denser. The trail was barely visible, covered in fallen leaves. Evan felt a prickle of anxiety, but pushed forward. As he descended, he noticed strange marks on the trees, deep gashes, as though something sharp had torn into the bark. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, reaching for him. Then he heard it, a faint sound, like whispering, carried on the wind. It was too soft to make out the words, but it sent a chill down his spine. He paused, straining to listen, but the whispers stopped. Shaking his head, he told himself it was just the wind and pressed on. The trail ended in a small clearing. At the center stood an old, crumbling stone structure, almost like a shrine. Moss and vines covered it, and the air around it felt heavy. Evan approached cautiously, his breath visible in the sudden cold. Carved into the stones were strange symbols, none of which he recognized. The whispers returned, louder now, as if coming from the stones themselves. He took a step back, heart pounding. Something about the place felt wrong, deeply wrong. "Turn back," a voice whispered behind him. He spun around, but no one was there. The clearing was empty. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift and writhe, and he realized with growing dread that he was no longer alone. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Evan backed away from the shrine, his eyes darting around the clearing. Then he saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms indistinct and shifting, as though made of smoke. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their movements were unnatural, jerky, yet fluid. Evan's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. One of the figures raised an arm, pointing directly at him. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice layered with many others, as if a dozen people were speaking at once. Finally, his paralysis broke. He turned and bolted back up the trail, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers followed him, growing louder and more chaotic, as if the forest itself was alive and angry. The trees seemed to close in, their branches clawing at him as he ran. He didn't stop until he burst out onto the main trail. The air was lighter here, the oppressive weight gone. He didn't look back, too terrified of what he might see. He ran all the way back to his truck, threw his pack into the bed, and sped away without a second glance. Evan never returned to that trail. He tried to research the symbols he'd seen on the shrine, but found nothing. The memory of the figures haunted him, their glowing eyes and distorted voices, a permanent fixture in his nightmares. He told himself it was just his imagination, that he'd let the strange woman's warning get into his head. But deep down, he knew the truth. Something was out there, something that didn't want to be found. Have you ever ignored a warning you shouldn't have? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales. Until next time, remember, not every path is meant to be walked.